Hello everyone and welcome to our final unit review, Unit 6, which is Life Science. Let's go ahead and get started. So we have talked about all four spheres at this point. We have talked about the hydrosphere, which has to do with water. We have talked about the atmosphere, which has to do with the gases surrounding the Earth. We have talked about the geosphere, which has to do with the land, the rock, the layers of the Earth. And now we are all of Unit 6 focused on the biosphere. And the biosphere is all parts of the geosphere and the atmosphere and the hydrosphere where life can exist. So we've talked about living things this unit. The first thing that we started talking about was biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are not living things. For example, air or wind, water, sunlight, soil or rocks, and temperature. Biotic things are living things. So for example, all the plants and animals in an ecosystem. And here's an image here to help you out with that. Then we talked about how are ecosystems organized. Ecosystems are organized from smallest to largest. So first we have an organism, which is one individual living thing. Then we have a population, which is a group of individuals of the same species that live together. So for example, trout fish or pit bull dogs or jackrabbits. Okay, that's a population. They have to be the same type of species. Then we have a community, which is all of the different populations of species that live and interact in an area. So now we're talking about the bullfrogs and the trout fish living together in an area. An ecosystem is a community of biotic and abiotic factors that interact with each other. So now we're adding in abiotic things. So now we're talking about the bullfrogs and the trout fish and also the water that they swim in, which is the abiotic factor. And then we talked about biomes, which are a bunch of ecosystems put together. And then biosphere is all parts on the earth where life can exist. And the mnemonic device to remember the organization of an ecosystem was old people can't eat big brownies. So organism, population, community, ecosystem, biome, and biosphere. Here's an image showing that. And instead of organism, it does say individual, but it's the same thing. So again, we have one single thing, one organism, and then a population is the same type of species. And then we have a community, which is all the different types of species. Ecosystem is now where we add the abiotic factors. So as you can see, water is added and rocks are added. Biomes are several ecosystems put together. And then biosphere is where all of the living things are at. Then we moved on to the carbon cycle. The basic thing that I want you to understand about the carbon cycle is it's an exchange of gases, okay? Carbon dioxide and oxygen. So sometimes oxygen is turned into carbon dioxide, sometimes carbon dioxide is turned into oxygen. Some examples are when plants respire, meaning plants put off oxygen and they take in carbon dioxide. That has to do with the carbon cycle. Animals put off carbon dioxide and take in oxygen. That's a cycle. These different things, dead organisms and waste products, pollution puts off carbon, turns into carbon dioxide, and then plants will take that back in and process it. They'll take in that carbon dioxide and that carbon and they will turn it into oxygen. So it's a big cycle of carbon dioxide and oxygen going back and forth. We also talked about the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is a cycle by which nitrogen is converted into multiple chemical forms as it circulates among the land, the atmosphere, and the marine ecosystems. So it's, again, this is another cycle where instead of carbon and oxygen switching back and forth, nitrogen is being converted into other things, okay? Then we talked about adaptations. Adaptations are any behavioral or physical characteristics of an animal that helps it to survive in its environment. So I did put an example over here, some behavioral adaptations over here on the left. It's things that organisms do to survive. So birds, they migrate in the winter so that they can get food all year. Chipmunks collect and store food so that they can find it in the winter. Opossums play dead to confuse predators. Woodchucks hibernate through a long winter. Plants grow towards the sunlight to capture more sunlight. Those are behavioral adaptations. And then there's also structural adaptations, which is physical things that an organism does to help it survive. So for example, polar bears have thick fur to keep it warm. Also, if you think about it, Polar bears are white. Why would they be white? Why are they more successful as white fur than instead of black fur? Well, of course, it's because it helps them blend into the snow, right? So there's a lot of different adaptations that animals have and we have as humans. Ducks have webbed feet to help them swim. Hawks have sharp claws to help them catch and kill their prey. Rabbits have large ears so that they can hear and avoid danger. And cactus have long roots to get water in the desert. And of course, you know that they store that water for a long period of time that they can use later. Then we talked about predation and parasitism, okay? A predator eats prey. So for example, a wolf eating a rabbit. Prey is something that is eaten by the predator. A rabbit is eaten by the wolf. In that case, the rabbit is the prey. A parasite lives off of a host for survival. So for example, a tick on a deer or a flea on a dog. A host is the organism that supports the parasite. So a dog supports a heartworm parasite, or a dog supports a flea. And then a couple other words that we learned were niche, which is the way in which an organism fits into a community, so its job in the ecosystem. And then competition. More than one individual or population is trying to make use of the same limited resources. So if we're all in a house together and we're starting to run out of food, we are now in competition for each other, and we're going to have to outsmart each other and possibly fight for that food. And that's an example of competition, and that happens all the time in nature. So here's a really good picture that I found. This is an example of predation. We have the predator and we have the prey. And then here's an example of parasitism. We have the parasite eating off of the host. And people like to confuse these a lot, but they are different. We also talked about food chains and food webs. Food chains and food webs show the path that the energy takes throughout an ecosystem. The arrows show you where the energy goes. So food chains are very simple. Usually they just go in a straight line, and food webs get a lot more complex, okay? Food webs are more realistic to our ecosystem. It's not that the only thing that eats grass are grasshoppers. We know that a lot of other things eat grass, for example, bunny rabbits, okay? So this is a little more realistic over here. But again, remember, the arrows show where the energy goes. So the energy from this plant goes into this grasshopper. The energy from this grasshopper goes into this rat. The energy from the rat goes into the owl. Okay? And then again, a food web is a bunch of food chains just put together. Follow the arrows, and that's where the energy goes. We also talked about producers, consumers, and decomposers. A producer gets its energy from the sun, and it makes food through photosynthesis, for example, plants and trees. Consumers cannot make their own food. They have to consume, for example, all animals or humans. And then finally, decomposers get their energy from eating dead plants and animals like fungi and bacteria. Here's an example of a food chain. Don't get confused just because it's not exactly perfectly in a straight line, it also goes down. This is still an example of a food chain. This is not quite a food web because there's just not enough going on here. So we have a producer feeding what we call a primary consumer. Primary means first. It's the first organism to eat. Secondary consumer means second organism. So the snake is going to eat this mouse. Tertiary means third. So this hawk or whatever it is going to eat the snake. Okay. And then finally, the decomposers, anytime that there's poop left over from these guys or anytime that they die, these decomposers will break those organisms down and return those nutrients to the soil, which will then allow more producers to grow. Also, I want you to remember that every food chain and every food web always starts with the sun. Without the sun, none of this would be happening. We then moved on to symbiotic relationships. Symbiosis is a close relationship between two species. So we have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Mutualism is a relationship between two species in which both species benefit. Both of them are happy. So for example, the saguaro cactus and a long-eared bat. Commensalism is a relationship between species in which one species is helped and the other one is like, whatever, I'm not affected. For example, the red-tailed hawk living in the saguaro cactus. And then finally, parasitism is a relationship between species in which one species, the parasite, benefits, and the other, the host, is harmed but not usually killed. So for example, a flea living on a dog's blood. Here is a good image to explain that. So for mutualism, both species benefit. For commensalism, one benefits and one just doesn't really care. And parasitism, one benefits and one is affected and harmed. Okay, so for example, a dog and a tick for parasitism, commensalism, a barnacle and a whale, and mutualism, a sea anemone and a clownfish. Um, I want to say for the barnacle and the whale, commensalism can easily turn into parasitism at any time. If that whale gets too many barnacles on it, hitching a ride, it's going to hinder that whale from being able to successfully swim. So any of these relationships at any time can turn into another relationship. Another thing that we talked about was biomes. A biome is a large region of Earth that has certain climate and certain types of living things. So many ecosystems put together make up a biome. The biome that has the most biodiversity is the tropical rainforest. And I want you to look at this picture and I want you to find the United States and I want you to identify what biome is the United States in. I'll give you about 10 seconds for that. So Michigan is going to be around here. So the biome that Michigan is in is a deciduous forest biome. And you can go ahead and take your time and look around, check out where different locations, what biomes they are in. Another thing that we talked about was limiting factors and carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the greatest number of individuals that an ecosystem can sustain, meaning how many living things can be in a certain area. And then limiting factors are anything in the ecosystem that would inhibit the continued growth of the ecosystem. For example, if a certain area doesn't have enough water or food or minerals or sunlight, that is going to stop the number of organisms that are allowed to live there. That's going to limit the carrying capacity. That's going to lessen the carrying capacity of that area. So both of these, carrying capacity and limiting factors, lead to competition. Organisms are going to fight for the water and the food and the sunlight and the minerals. And I think that's about it for that one. We then moved on to primary succession. Primary succession is a type of ecological succession in which plants and animals first colonize a barren, lifeless habitat. Now, putting that in easier terms, that means that there was never anything there. It was bare rock, and then lichens came in, which is like little things, mosses growing on rocks. And then small plants and lichens started to grow in, so you're starting to see some greenery. Then some grasses start growing in, and then we start seeing little trees and little shrubs, and then we have a climax community. So the first species that take over an area that start to grow in are called pioneer species. And then in the middle, we have intermediate species, and the goal is to become a climax community, meaning that everything is mature, the trees are mature, and there's a lot of animals moving into the area. Now, the difference between primary and secondary succession is that secondary succession started at a climax community and something happened. A flood came in, a forest fire happened, and it burned everything down or wiped everything out. Now, secondary succession takes a lot less time to come back because things were already there and there's already nutrients in the soil. So if a fire comes in and wipes it out, it's going to be a little bit quicker for it to reach that climax community again. And then the last thing that we talked about was how do we impact our environment? Humans can both positively and negatively impact our environment. So here are some examples. Positive impacts: we recycle, we plant trees, we protect endangered species, and we find ways for cleaner energy. That's just naming a few. But the more good that we do, it seems like the more harm that we do too. We pollute, which causes acid rain. We are causing the climate to change by all the things that we're doing. We're cutting down trees, which is deforestation and desertification. I have a hard time saying that word. We overpopulate and we overconsume the resources that are available to us. So we have to be careful and do the best that we can for our planet. I think that's about it. So I think I covered Unit 6. It was a crazy year, but we made it work, guys. So good job for sticking with us if you're listening to this right now for this long. And we'll be talking to you soon. Talk to you later. Bye.